Hi everyone, I'm Christian from Canadian Film Lab, and today I'm going to give you the most important tip you could ever receive for your film photography. Understanding this one important principle is the secret to transforming the quality of your film photos. So today's tip is all about the relationship between image brightness and exposure. And to demonstrate this, I'm going old school today with a clipboard, a piece of paper and a pen. So I'm going to draw you two graphs. My first graph at the top here is going to show you the relationship between exposure and image brightness when you're shooting a digital camera. My graph at the bottom here is going to demonstrate the relationship between exposure and film density when you're shooting film. And you'll notice that I said film density rather than image brightness, and there's a very good reason for that. So make sure you watch until the end of the video when the reason for that will become clear. So when it comes to your digital camera, the relationship between exposure and brightness is what we call linear. So it would look something like this, a straight line. So as you increase exposure, you would expect your image brightness to increase in proportion with the exposure that you apply. So you would imagine that as you increase your exposure, your highlights at some point would actually be blown. So the relationship essentially is that the shadows and the highlights respond equally to exposure. So now we'll look at film and the relationship between exposure and film density. So if you remember earlier, I mentioned that we're looking at film density rather than image brightness. So for this, I want you to think more in terms of detail in your image. So the relationship between exposure and film density isn't linear like we saw with the digital camera. It's what we call logarithmic. And this is a simplified version, but the relationship between the exposure and density looks something like this. So now we've got our two graphs, let's look a little bit closer at the relationship between exposure and density on film, and then we'll look at a comparison between digital and film. So as we can see here on film, as we increase our exposure, film density eventually stops responding, and we can see that the curve starts to plateau and peak. And the great thing about this is that it means that we can increase our exposure and the highlights will eventually stop responding to that exposure, which is the explanation as to why it's actually very difficult to blow highlights on film. The shadows, on the other hand, continue to respond to exposure when you're shooting film, unlike when we looked at the relationship between exposure and image brightness on a digital camera. Shadows and highlights respond equally to exposure, so as we increase our exposure, eventually the highlights will be blown. Whereas with film, we can see here, it starts to plateau and they stop responding and they reach a maximum density. Whereas the shadows, we can keep increasing exposure and we'll reach an optimal level of density where we've got lots of detail in the negative. So what does this mean in practice for when it comes to shooting film? When people start out shooting film for the first time, it can be tempting to, for example, take a picture with your digital camera and then look at the settings and then mirror those on your film camera, and you might expect that that would give you great results, but it doesn't. And the reason is because of the relationship between exposure and image brightness and exposure and film density, like we saw in the graphs. With digital, we're more worried about blowing highlights, whereas on film, it's very difficult to blow highlights, so we expose for the darker part of the image. And in doing that, what we do is increase the density of the negative to a point where we have great detail across the entire tonal range. And this brings me back to what I mentioned earlier when we said that we were talking about film density rather than image brightness. So you might be thinking, well, how do I impact the brightness of my image when I'm shooting film? And the reality is that as a photographer, there's actually very little you can do in camera to impact the final brightness of your image. It's actually the person scanning your film that sets the level of the brightness. So it's really important to remember this one key principle when shooting film. Increasing your exposure does not increase your image brightness. For example, if you're looking for a darker image, don't be tempted to reduce your exposure because you will risk producing an underexposed image with very little detail. Simply communicate your preference for a darker image to us at the lab and we will scan it that way. Similarly, if you're looking for a brighter image, expose for the darker part of your scene and communicate your preferences to us at the lab, and we can set the image brightness that you're looking for. So we hope this has been really helpful in explaining the relationship between image brightness and exposure on film. And if you have any more questions at all, please feel free to just leave a comment on this post and we'll get back to you soon.